I just got a phone call. And it was like, I think it was like that for everyone. It was just so horrific. You couldn't take it in, and I couldn't take it in.
When people think of Paul McCartney, they often picture a legend with a friendly smile and timeless hits. But in reality, he is someone deeply vulnerable and extremely sensitive to criticism. In an interview, Paul McCartney revealed a personal blacklist, a group of people he has despised for life. Among them, a soulmate who turned his back on him for the sake of a woman, a music legend who dared to strip him of his songs, a deranged murderer, and a financial fox who dragged the legendary band into collapse. Who were these faces? And why had McCartney never revealed this list until now? Paul McCartney was born in 1942 into a working-class family. The sudden death of his mother from breast cancer when he was only 14 left a deep scar, but it also sparked his love for music, a way to heal from loss. In 1957, Paul met John Lennon. They quickly became close and together with George Harrison and Ringo Starr formed the legendary band, the Beatles. Within the group, Paul played bass, sang lead vocals, and was one of the two primary songwriters. Over more than 60 years, Paul McCartney not only became a world-famous musician, but also one of the richest figures in the music industry, with an estimated fortune of over $1 billion. In 1997, he was nabbed by the Queen of England. Yet behind that dazzling success lay shadows. Paul McCartney was infamous for being difficult and a relentless perfectionist, often forcing the band to re-record a passage dozens of times. His strictness helped the Beatles create immortal works, but it also bred resentment. George Harrison once stormed out in anger while John Lennon openly mocked Paul in his song, "How Do You Sleep?" McCartney never hid his ambition. He wanted to be seen as equal to, if not greater than, Lennon. That drive earned him the reputation of having a big ego and being calculating. If Lennon was the dreamer and Rebel McCartney was the pragmatist, focused on business and music rights. This practical side gave him a career that endured for decades, but also made him a thorn in the side of many fellow musicians. To the public, Paul McCartney has always been the friendly Beatle. But behind the spotlight, he is a man deeply sensitive and vulnerable to criticism. He once sank into depression, drank heavily, and at times felt so broken he couldn't even write music. These scars made him retreat inward, rarely speaking of personal conflicts for decades. Yet recently, in a candid conversation with the press, McCartney admitted for the first time he truly has a list of famous people he absolutely despises. That list, in his words, is nothing less than the wounds in his life that never healed. 1. Michael Jackson. The betrayal from a fellow brother. In the early 1980s, Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson were an unlikely pair of friends. They were very close, often talking and collaborating. At the time, McCartney saw Michael as a younger brother, and Jackson looked up to Paul as a veteran in the industry. During one of their conversations, McCartney shared a secret to success in the music industry with Michael Jackson invest in song copyrights. He told him that he had bought the rights to a number of works by other authors and, as a result, had a steady source of income. No one expected Michael Jackson to do the same thing, but in a way, that would stun McCartney. In 1985, ATV Music, the company that owned most of the Beatles' song copyrights, was put up for sale. Jackson, who was at the peak of his career, had enough money and decided to make a move. For about $47.5 million, Michael Jackson officially acquired this massive music catalog. For McCartney, this was nothing short of a stab in the back. He felt betrayed because he was the one who had advised Michael to invest in copyrights, and he never expected this king of pop to apply the advice to take over the Beatles' legacy. After the tense transaction, the relationship between McCartney and Jackson fractured. Later, when Michael faced financial difficulties, many expected him to sell the Beatles' copyrights back to McCartney. But that never happened. In fact, Jackson even partnered with Sony, continuing to hold the catalog for many years afterward. For McCartney, this was one of the biggest mistakes of his life. His once beautiful friendship with Michael Jackson ended in bitterness, and Paul has never forgiven him for it. Later, in many interviews, McCartney stated directly that he felt betrayed. "I thought we were friends, but then Michael turned it into a business deal. That stab in the back ended a beautiful friendship. But it was just the beginning of a list of deep cracks in Paul McCartney's life. Because if Michael Jackson was a shock, The next person was the pain of a brotherhood that turned into a public battle for the whole world to see. 2. John Lennon. From soulmate to public enemy on live TV, Paul McCartney and John Lennon were kindred spirits co-writing over 200 timeless songs together. The Lennon-McCartney formula became iconic even though in reality many songs were primarily written by one person. But from the mid-1960s, the distance between them grew. Lennon hated the sweet image that McCartney was building, while McCartney was annoyed by Lennon's wild lifestyle. When Brian Epstein, the Beatles' financial manager, passed away, the band immediately fell into chaos. McCartney wanted the band to continue seriously moving in a direction of great creativity. In contrast, Lennon was bored and wanted to break free from the Beatles to find his true self with Yoko Ono. This difference caused constant arguments between McCartney and Lennon. McCartney wanted to control the band's musical direction, while Lennon accused Paul of being an artistic dictator. George Harrison even once left a recording session because he couldn't stand McCartney's demands. The conflict reached its peak when the Beatles broke up. McCartney proactively sued the other members in court to dissolve the company Apple Corps. Lennon saw this as a betrayal. In 1971, Lennon wrote the song How Do You Sleep on the album Imagine. In it, he directly attacked McCartney. The only thing you done was yesterday, alluding to Paul's reliance on his famous song, Yesterday. Paul was deeply hurt. For years, he repeatedly mentioned this song in interviews with bitterness. He said it was painful to hear John sing that. Afterward, McCartney also retaliated with songs like Too Many People, which included a subtle jab at Lennon and Yoko. You took your lucky break and broke it in two. But fate is ironic. The taunt still echoed, while the chance for reconciliation slowly faded. And then before McCartney could even say a word of forgiveness, a gunshot in New York forever took Lennon's life, simultaneously closing the last door to reconciliation. 3. Mark David Chapman, the one who took Lennon and severed all chances for the Beatles' reconciliation. On December 8, 1980, a grim cloud hung over New York as John Lennon was assassinated right in front of the Dakota building where he lived with Yoko Ono. The perpetrator, Mark David Chapman, was a 25-year-old man who was once a fan of the Beatles, but had a disturbed mind and a morbid obsession with Lennon. That morning, Chapman quietly waited outside. When Lennon left for the recording studio, Chapman handed him the album Double Fantasy to sign. John smiled, signed it, and left completely unaware that a few hours later, that very hand would pull the trigger, around 1000 p.m. When Lennon and Yoko returned, Chapman was hiding in the shadows. As soon as John stepped inside the doorway, he pulled out a handgun and fired 5 shots in quick succession or hit Lennon in the back. Blood stained the Dakota steps. John Lennon collapsed in Yoko's arms, only able to utter, "I've been shot." Mark David Chapman stood there, opened his copy of The Catcher in the Rye, and waited for the police to arrest him. When he heard that John Lennon had died, Paul McCartney was in a state of shock. As he left the recording studio, reporters surrounded McCartney, thrusting microphones into his face and shouting, "Paul, what do you think about John being shot?" Paul McCartney was flustered, but he didn't want to cry on camera. He stammered out a short, simple sentence. "It's a drag." That statement immediately caused a storm. Headlines screamed McCartney's cold reaction to Lennon's death. Many fans were outraged, accusing Paul of being cold and gloating over Lennon's death. In reality, there were still unhealed cracks between him and John. Lennon had written songs to mock McCartney and Paul, often complained about being looked down upon by John. However, despite their conflicts, Paul still considered John his only creative brother. That's why Lennon's death didn't just take away a friend. It also took away their last chance to reconcile. Paul once said in an interview, "Mark Chapman didn't just kill John, he stole a piece of the Beatles' soul. He ended any hope that we could sit down together." For decades, McCartney never mentioned Chapman's name normally. He called him a coward, a damned psycho. Every time the Beatles were honored by the public, McCartney was pained by the memory that the image of the four of them together only existed in memory and could never be revived. But that wasn't the most bitter thing. A few weeks before his death, Lennon had started talking about possibly collaborating again with Paul. They had called each other and chatted in a friendly way as they once did. But everything came to a halt on the night of December 8th. McCartney carried this pain for a lifetime, and Chapman is the name he hates to the core. However, if Chapman was the trigger puller behind that tragic curtain, was a name that always loomed over every debate about the Beatles' breakup. A person who was seen as both a victim and a culprit, and that is the person McCartney hates most. 4. Yoko Ono, the one behind the friendship's breakup. Before 1968, the Beatles' recording studio was almost a private sanctuary. But when John Lennon brought Yoko Ono to sit beside him at every recording session, the atmosphere immediately changed. Yoko Ono was known for her extremely strong personality and her desire to control everything around John Lennon. Because of this, Paul McCartney, who was a perfectionist and strict in his work, was extremely annoyed. He saw Yoko's interference in their songwriting and direct involvement in musical discussions as an invasion. McCartney once admitted, "I don't resent Yoko for being with John, but I hate the way things changed once she appeared." Many researchers believe that this is when the Lennon-McCartney friendship began to crack. When the Beatles broke up, McCartney repeatedly hinted that Yoko was the cause. In interviews, he often repeated the opinion that John had completely changed since he was with Yoko. John's musical and personal decisions from the late 1960s were directly influenced by his wife. On her side, Yoko Ono was not shy about attacking Paul McCartney. Yoko made no secret of her artistic and power ambitions. She saw her relationship with John Lennon not just as love, but as a combination to elevate their names. She once said that Lennon was the real creative soul, while Paul was only good at writing catchy melodies. These words were a stab at McCartney's pride, a man who had spent his life wanting to be recognized as Lennon's equal. One of the biggest conflicts between McCartney and Yoko was over song copyrights. According to the original agreement, all of the Beatles' songs were credited as Lennon-McCartney, regardless of who was the main writer. After Lennon's death, Yoko was determined to protect John's position. When McCartney proposed changing some songs to McCartney-Lennon, Yoko fiercely objected. Paul McCartney argued that he just wanted to correct the historical record, but Yoko Ono saw it as an act of erasing John. This argument lasted for decades in the press and among lawyers. McCartney once said, "You wants to rewrite history in a way that benefits her and John, but I can't let that happen." In response, Yoko repeatedly criticized Paul's music as simplistic, saying that compared to Jay's, it was just empty entertainment music. Even in a 1981 poll conducted by Rolling Stone, Yoko even voted for Paul as the least important Beatle. This further strained the relationship between the two. Wasn't until the late 1990s, when McCartney participated in the Anthology Project and re-released some of the Beatles' recordings, that he and Yoko made some gestures of reconciliation. However, the distrust never completely disappeared. In one interview, McCartney said with a hint of bitterness, "I don't hate Yoko, but if it weren't for her, the Beatles might have stayed together for a few more years. It didn't stop there." Even within the band, a quiet younger brother once rose in protest, leaving Paul with an unforgettable professional wound. 5. George Harrison. A heavy conflict in the workplace. Paul McCartney and George Harrison had a serious conflict over their working styles. In the recording studio, McCartney was an extreme perfectionist. He often ordered Harrison to play his instrument exactly as he wanted, even directing him on every guitar note. Harrison was a talented guitarist, but he was less respected as a songwriter than John Lennon or McCartney. This made him feel more and more looked down upon. During the recording of the album Let It Be, McCartney constantly asked Harrison to play a part over and over again. The atmosphere became so heavy that Harrison stood up and walked out, leaving the rest of the band stunned. This wasn't the only time. In many albums, the meticulous guitar solos Harrison arranged were rejected or changed by McCartney. To Harrison, this was an insult, pushing him out of the spotlight and making him a surplus in the band he was a part of. Harrison often complained that McCartney wouldn't listen to his ideas. Even in later albums, many of the guitar solos Harrison wrote were rejected by McCartney, while he also wanted to prove that he was a true songwriter, not just a side guitarist. Although they maintained a polite relationship, Harrison made no secret of his exhaustion with McCartney. In an interview, he stated bluntly, Working with Paul is like having your hands tied. He always thinks he knows everything. This conflict didn't end when the Beatles broke up. Harrison and McCartney continued to clash in legal disputes over copyrights in the company Apple Corps. The truth is, there was never any harmony between them. McCartney, who wanted to control every detail, and Harrison, who longed to be recognized as an independent musician, were forever two opposites who could never meet. And it was Paul's musical tyranny that turned Harrison from a loyal Beatle into a rebel. But personal conflicts were just the tip of the iceberg. What truly shattered the relationship between the members came from an outsider, a cunning mogul who stepped in at the most chaotic time for the Beatles. 6. Alan Clean, the swindler behind the plot to take over the Beatles. In 1967, after manager Brian Epstein's sudden death, the Beatles fell into a crisis. All 4 members were talented musicians, but none had business experience. At that time, the Beatles' empire was expanding with Apple Films, Apple Corps, a recording studio, a store, and new artists signing contracts. But everything was chaotic, and money was being lost. While John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr were in a state of confusion, Alan Clean appeared as a savior. Clean was famous for managing the Rolling Stones and Sam Cooke, and was praised as someone who protected artists against greedy record company bosses. He promised to make the Beatles richer than ever before. From the beginning, Paul McCartney was suspicious of Alan Klein's motives. Paul thought he spoke too smoothly and smelled of lies. He wanted the Beatles to work with Eastman and Eastman, his wife Linda McCartney's family law firm, because he trusted them more. But John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr were convinced by Clean. Lennon particularly liked Clean because he told the truth, no beating around the bush. Even Harrison and Starr thought Paul was just being selfish and favoring his in-laws. In 1969, all 3 members of the Beatles, except McCartney, signed a contract with Clean, making him their official manager. Paul was furious and refused to sign. He knew that from that moment on, he would be sidelined in financial decisions. Klein began to restructure Apple Corps, firing employees and cutting projects, and did indeed help the Beatles increase profits in the short term. But McCartney believed it was just a temporary trick. He believed that Clean was secretly skimming money from the band. On December 31, 1970, Paul McCartney did something shocking. He sued the other remaining members of the Beatles. The lawsuit was not only to dissolve the group, but also to sever the contract with Alan Clean. When the news broke that Paul McCartney sues John Lennon, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, the whole world was outraged and turned against him. McCartney was seen as a traitor, the killer of the Beatles. But in reality, he did it to get out from under Clean. Just as McCartney predicted a few years later, Clean was found guilty of financial fraud. He took a higher commission than agreed upon, secretly kept royalties from artists, and was even prosecuted for tax evasion. In 1977, Klein had to repay the Beatles over $800,000 after a lawsuit. John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr then bitterly admitted that Paul had been right to be suspicious of him. But by then, it was too late. The Beatles had broken up, and there was no way to save them. In later interviews, McCartney often mentioned that Alan Clean was the one who killed the Beatles legally and financially. He called Cleany a swindler and never forgave the other 3 members for turning their backs on him to join forces with Cleany. Alan Clean broke up the Beatles with numbers on paper. But after the band's existence, a more ruthless hand appeared. And that person turned the Beatles' last album into a controversial scar that remains to this day. 7. Phil Spector, the producer who ruined Let It Be by 1970. The Beatles were on the verge of breaking up. The Get Back project, which Paul McCartney had hoped would be a simple, raw return to their roots, was a mess of controversial recording sessions. When Alan Clean, whom Paul already hated, brought in Phil Spector to rescue the project, everything immediately turned into a disaster. Phil Spector was famous for his wall of sound style, where the music was grand, dense, and layered, sounding like an entire orchestra hitting you at once. But Paul didn't want that at all. His song, The Long and Winding Road, was written as a private, sad, and gentle ballad like a sigh. However, when Spector got his hands on it, the song suddenly turned into a musical. He brought in an entire symphony orchestra, brass, and a female choir obscuring Paul's vocals. Worse, some of Paul's original vocal tracks were even erased to make room for the layers of instruments. When Paul heard the first mix, he was so angry, he almost went crazy. Paul immediately sat down and wrote a furious letter to Klein and Spector with cold but razor-sharp lines. Get the strings, the brass, the choir, and all that noisy stuff off. That was Paul's way of shouting, "You have insulted me! You have insulted my song." But all his requests were ignored. In May 1970, the album Let It Be was released with Spector's heavy mix. Paul's song topped the American charts, but for him it was a dirty victory. He saw it as a stab in the back, proof that the Beatles were no longer the Beatles. George Martin, the producer who had been with the band from the beginning, couldn't stand it either. He sneered, "This album should be credited." Produced by George Martin and ruined by Phil Spector. As for Spector, he showed no remorse. On the contrary, he was arrogant. Paul has been performing my mix live for decades and even won an Oscar for Let It Be. If he wants to start a war, he's picked the wrong opponent. For Paul, this event was a wound that would never heal. For many years, he still mentioned it as proof of the betrayal. Over 30 years later, Paul finally got his revenge. In 2003, he released Let It Be Naked, which stripped away everything Spector had added. The long and winding road returned to its original form. Simple, sincere, with only the raw sound of the piano and vocals. It was more than just an album. For Paul, it was a declaration. I am the owner of this music and no one has the right to destroy it. Let it be. Naked helped Paul McCartney get justice for his own song. But while the musical wounds were still bleeding, another slap this time, not from the recording studio, but from the man on the big stage in America, came his way. 8. Frank Sinatra, the man who mocked yesterday and slapped the Beatles in the face. Initially, Paul McCartney and Frank Sinatra had no animosity towards each other. To Paul, Sinatra was a symbol of a romantic, elegant musical era that he always admired. Despite belonging to two completely different generations and musical styles, there was a subtle mutual respect between them. However, this relationship gradually soured. Sinatra publicly criticized rock and roll, calling it a pile of garbage for rebellious kids. To Paul McCartney, who had helped the Beatles ignite the rock and roll wave worldwide, those words were like a cold shower. It wasn't just a JBE, it was a complete rejection of an entire generation of music. The conflict reached its peak when Sinatra bluntly mocked the song Yesterday, one of Paul's most sacred works. In front of an audience, Sinatra didn't hesitate to call it the saddest song ever written and even ridiculed its melody. Hearing these words, Paul felt incredibly angry and hurt. It didn't stop at words. At one performance, Sinatra sang George Harrison's song, Something, and introduced it to the audience. Here's the best love song that Lennon and McCartney ever wrote. A seemingly harmless statement accidentally erased Harrison's contribution. This made McCartney feel awkward and annoyed. For Paul, it was proof that Sinatra had never truly recognized the Beatles as equal musicians. In his eyes, they were just guys who make loud music. Although they never openly confronted each other, a subtle contempt always existed between these two men. It was a clash of two worlds, one of classic elegant music and the other of the rebellious spirit of rock and roll. In this invisible war, a single JBE was enough to turn respect into a crack that would never heal. But why has McCartney never revealed this list before? It's not because he lacks the courage, but because he understands the price he would have to pay would be too high. In the eyes of millions of fans, McCartney is the friendly Beatle, the one who brings love, optimism, and faith in a better world. He is a symbol of peace concerts, one of the most approachable artists of the century. If one day McCartney were to stand up and read a list of his enemies, everything would immediately collapse. People would no longer see a forgiving artist, but a bitter, petty old man. In Anglo-American culture, publicly airing a grudge list is akin to confessing selfishness and unprofessionalism. And McCartney, more than anyone else, understands that his image is just as important as his music. McCartney has lived long enough to understand the destructive power of the press. A single misspoken word and interview that reveals his anger can turn into a media storm that lasts for months. If he were to publicly hate someone, Lennon, Sinatra, or Phil Spector the next day, All the headlines would turn it into a war between legends. McCartney would be pushed into a spiral of scandal where every subsequent word would be distorted and exaggerated. For him, silence is not weakness, but the only way to avoid turning personal pain into media amusement. And the biggest reason the Beatles are not just a band. They are a symbol of peace, love, and unity, a legacy that goes far beyond music. McCartney knows that if he were to publicly hate Lennon Yoko Ono or even George Harrison, the mythical statue of the Beatles would crack. What the four Liverpool lads built the image of a close friendship of a generation of dreamers would turn into fragments. McCartney knows that this legacy is more important than his personal ego, and he chooses to bury his wounds so that the world can forever have an intact Beatles in its memory. The English have a cultural tradition of staying silent and not airing grievances in public. Paul McCartney grew up in that atmosphere, and he chose a more subtle way of reacting. When he's dissatisfied, he never slams his hand on the table and curses. He lets the music speak. The song Too Many People is an example with its taunts against John Lennon but hidden within a sweet melody. For McCartney, that's a way to save face while still retaliating. The music industry is a small village. Artists' relationships overlap from performances to copyrights. If he were to publicly hate someone, McCartney would be closing many doors to collaboration. Even a legend like him needs a network of connections to maintain his influence. So staying silent is not just polite, it's also a way to protect his career. On the list of people McCartney hates, many have passed away. John Lennon, George Harrison, Frank Sinatra, Phil Spector. Publicly holding a grudge against the dead would make McCartney seem petty and cowardly. In his later years, he wants to be seen as a generous person without grudges to have a serene and forgiving final image. Not only that, Paul McCartney has long been more than just a musician. He is a global brand, an economic machine operating with almost perfect precision. His tours are sold out, bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars. The copyrights to his songs are valued at a huge sum, surpassing even many small record labels. And above all, McCartney has become a cross-generational icon, from those who grew up with the Beatles in the 60s to today's youth who still hum and Hey Jude. In this brand game, an artist with a positive, happy, optimistic image will sell more tickets and music and win over audiences more easily than a grumpy, resentful old man. McCartney understands this. That's why his silence about his list of enemies is not a weakness, but a clever PR move, a sophisticated form of image control to ensure both his economic interests and the immortality of the Paul McCartney brand. In fact, McCartney has never lacked the means to retaliate. He chose music as a secret battlefield. His song, Too Many People, couldn't hide its attacks on Lennon. In response, Lennon released How Do You Sleep, a song like a dagger aimed straight at McCartney's heart. Both used music as a weapon, disguising their bitter blows with melodies and lyrics. McCartney didn't need to shout, "I hate you!" because by just listening, the audience could more than understand who he was aiming his arrow at. But the issue becomes more complicated when many of his enemies are associated with people he holds dear. Yoko Ono is not just a controversial artist. She is also John Lennon's wife. And John, despite their conflicts, was the brother who wrote a chapter of the Beatles' history with him. Publicly showing animosity would mean rubbing salt in the wounds of the Lennon family, and even worse, hurting millions of loyal fans who see the Beatles as a symbol of love and peace. McCartney knows that if he adds more cracks, the Beatles' legacy will shatter, and the most beautiful memory in the hearts of the audience will turn into a tragedy. That's why he chose silence to keep the memory intact. Moreover, McCartney is deeply aware that history is a harsh filter. He knows that if he makes a single slip of the tongue, "I hate Sinatra, I resent Lennon, I despise Spector," then 50 or 100 years from now, future generations might not remember him as the author of Let It Be, but only as the bitter old man. That is the psychological trap McCartney has always been careful to avoid, not letting bitterness overshadow his music. Now in his 80s, McCartney often talks about reconciliation instead of hatred. He appears on stage with a smile, still performing with the energy of his youth. He wants to be remembered as an artist who brought love and optimism to the world, not a resentful old man. For McCartney, forgiveness, or at least silence, is the final gift he can leave for his audience and for history. People often say that time heals all wounds. But McCartney has proven that it's not just time, but a person's choice that determines whether a wound becomes an ugly scar or a gentle memory. In his twilight years, as the stage lights dim, he still wants to leave an image for the world. An artist with a guitar, a gentle smile, and melodies that bring the belief that love always conquers hatred. And perhaps that is the real list of enemies Paul McCartney holds in his heart. Not the names of those who hurt him, but the darkness, the wounds, and the hatred that he has chosen to pack away so that music can tell the rest of the story for him. Ultimately, when people mention Paul McCartney, they not only remember Yesterday or Hey Jude, but they also remember a person who went through breakdowns, disputes, and even bitterness, yet who resolutely chose light, love, and reconciliation as his final legacy. And perhaps that is why, even as many legends have turned to dust, McCartney still sings, still shines, and remains in the hearts of millions of fans. If these stories have left you with a lingering sense of unease, try to put yourself in their shoes and share your feelings. Remember to follow along, because what we've just revealed is only the first crack in a magnificent wall. Behind it lies an intricate network of secrets, because a legend is not always woven from light and applause. Sometimes it's patched together from silent pains, wounds that never speak, and conflicts hidden behind the scenes. There are secrets that seem to have sunk with the passage of time. But all it takes is a small crack for the past to erupt, violently sweeping away the layer of glamour we once believed in. And that's when we have to face the question, do we know the whole truth, or are we just standing in front of the first curtain?